Hello and welcome to Hazard and Hope. I'm Ed, and in this episode we're going to be looking at how you can make a cafe or restaurant more flood resilient. So here we go. This episode of Hazard and Hope is sponsored by Aviva. So first things first, why would you need to make your business more flood resilient? Well, unfortunately, with the frequency and severity of flood events increasing as a result of climate change, we can expect to see many more businesses exposed to and affected by flooding. And when somewhere like a cafe or a restaurant does flood, as we can see here, the damage can be extensive and wide-ranging. Things like chipboard cabinet carcasses can swell and distort. We see ovens, fridges and freezers contaminated and broken beyond repair, as well as floor and wall linings inundated, and many materials will need to be gutted from the building and thrown into skips. This damage can significantly disrupt business continuity, and the experience as a whole can be a very stressful and draining process to endure. But the positive thing to note is that there are many practical things that we can do to design and adapt a cafe or a restaurant to be more flood resilient. Be it fitting flood barriers, changing the setup of electrical systems, or the types of floors, walls and kitchen furniture that's fitted. Lisa, for example, at the Blue Teapot Cafe in Mythenroyd that we can see here, had only owned the business for a couple of months before it flooded. But actually, in repairing and reinstating the premises, Lisa decided to adapt its design and materials to be more flood resilient, so there'd be less damage and disruption if or when a flood were to occur again. Before we dive in to look at strategies, a crucial thing to remember is that with all of this, context is key, and that the suitability of strategies for making a property and business resilient will depend on your specific setup, where your business is located, the property type, as well as the clients, businesses and potentially customers' preferences. Now, this wide range of factors to consider may seem overwhelming, but a really simple way to approach this is to follow the process that's set out in the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience. And what this does is help us approach things in a logical way with a joined up approach that professionals throughout the industry are now being trained on and recommended to follow. And bear in mind that this applies to existing as well as new build contexts, to multiple as well as individual properties, and for both residential, public and commercial buildings. So the first stage, as you'll see here, is the hazard assessment. And that's really focused on understanding the flood risk context. So we'd want to find out what the sources of flooding are, as there are many different types of flooding and each will require a different response. We'd then need to know what the actual routes and pathways are by which floodwater could reach the premises. And we'd of course need to determine actually how frequent or severe floods may be. And that will help inform the types of strategies and the levels at which particular items are positioned at within the business, as well as the overall layout and materiality of the building. We've put links in the description below this video to a range of flood map resources that may also be of interest as well. Next, we have the property survey. And this helps us assess the building's current level of flood resilience and provides information for the detailed design of property flood resilience measures. It'll also include things like the construction type of the property and the property setup, as well as the actual end user requirements themselves. These aspects can significantly influence the types of strategies that you use further down the line. For example, your cafe could be on a high street and sit as one in a row of terraced properties. And if that's the case, then you need to be aware that the floodwater could enter and flow in the party wall between you and your neighbouring property. Or it could be that your business is being run from a historic property, or one with a timber frame structure or facade, and you may be limited in the types of flood barriers and resistance measures that are appropriate to use. So getting a survey will help actually understand the existing setup and inform appropriate choices further down the line. And also I'd say do make sure that your surveyor is following the steps and requirements set out within the Code of Practice. And then once you've had stages 1 and 2 completed, you then should have a detailed picture of actually both the flood risk context and the property setup. And this can then help inform the next stage, which is options development and design. And this is then the time that we can actually start to look at different design strategies and options for adaptation and resilience. Now, as we can see in the diagram here, it could well be that flood resistance measures are used, such as flood doors or deployable flood barriers. And these can actually help to slow the rate at which floodwater enters the building. But be warned though that their suitability does depend on the type of flood risk and the property setup, as well as the occupant's requirements. Now, it could be that in addition to or instead of those resistance measures, you actually look to make the property more flood recoverable, so that you limit the damage if or when floodwater enters the building. Now, that recoverable approach could be actually having furniture that's easy to move, fold and stack, positioning stock, servers and valuable items at a higher level, and specifying materials for the floors and walls that won't actually be unduly damaged by floodwater and easy to dry out and decontaminate post-flood. I mean, even having actually raised power sockets and wiring fed from the first floor down can have a huge impact and reduce the time it can take for reinstatement. In developing these options, it's also crucial to consider things like their lifetime requirements, what the indicative costs may be for these works, and actually how the strategy relates to your particular end user and business preferences. But it's good to bear in mind that as well as actually flood resilience at the property level, there are often also interventions that could be made around the business to reduce flood risk. I mean, it could, for example, be that you actually incorporate things like permeable paving or swales into or around the parking areas, or disconnect the property's downpipe and actually have it feed into a planter or a rain garden. And what these can help to do is to help reduce the volume and rate at which our drainage networks are inundated during and after a period of heavy rainfall. Now, when we're considering actually how we can adapt or design a cafe or a restaurant to be flood resilient, I think it's really useful to actually separate it out into the various components that you can see here. So we've got the building envelope, its perimeter and its plumbing, the kitchen and its electrics, furniture, floors, walls, and wider business continuity elements. So to begin with, let's look at the external envelope and perimeter of the building, as well as its plumbing. And that's really informed by the potential points of floodwater entry. Now, the hazard assessment and the survey in stages 1 and 2 of the Code of Practice might have actually shown that the front door of your or shop front of your business is a potential weak point and route of floodwater entry. So it might be worth actually having a flood door fitted, or even mounting brackets that a deployable flood barrier can be slotted and locked into. Or it might well be that there's cracks in brickwork or the mortar, and these need to be repaired and properly reinstated. Alternatively, it could be that you have standard air bricks and, say, suspended timber floor. Now, that could well be a potential weak point and route of floodwater entry into the building. It could enter into the void beneath the suspended timber floor and rise up and flood you from beneath. Now, you could well look to have manual air brick covers or automatic air bricks fitted there to stop the water getting into that underfloor void, and if any water does get in, it might be that you have a pump and sump fitted to help keep that water at a lower level beneath the timber floor. So, as you can see here, there's many potential configurations and factors to consider, but really it just needs to be a contextual response. And that doesn't mean asking your neighbour or business down the road what they've done. It needs to apply to your specific business and building. Now, it could be that the floodwater actually backflows and surcharges up through your sewage or drainage network and floods you from within. So in those contexts where this is a risk, it makes a lot of sense to have non-return valves fitted on the drainage feeds for things like dishwashers, toilets and sinks. These essentially make it so that as floodwaters rise, they don't backflow through that system. Now, to be doubly safe, there are things like bungs that can be fitted to provide a second line and point of protection. But it might also be that you position radiators at a higher level, or ones that are easy to detach, and your boiler mounted high up on the wall or on a different floor of the building entirely. Next, let's look at the kitchen. And when it comes to a cafe or restaurant, this really will be one of the key areas to consider in terms of flood resilience. And we've made an episode specifically about flood resilient kitchen design, but the general principles to note is that we really want to do all we can to reduce the number of items that could be exposed to floodwater. And for those that will come into contact with it, we ensure that they're made of materials that won't be unduly damaged and can be quickly and easily decontaminated post-flood. Now, as you can see here, compressed wood and chipboard laminate carcasses in particular can very easily swell and distort when they come into contact with floodwater. And furthermore, if the end boards of the structure or the carcass are sitting on the floor, then really even a shallow depth of floodwater could seep, soak and spread upwards through the material. In a commercial kitchen setting, it might well be that you have stainless steel kitchen units, and that could well be a functional culinary choice and one that suits the aesthetics of the space. But they'll also be much more resilient and recoverable if or when a flood does occur. But it doesn't have to be that you go down the stainless steel route, and as we can see here, there are now a range of products on the market that are more flood recoverable and I'd say look like standard kitchen carcasses and cabinets. Marine ply is also a material that could be specified for this purpose, There are also cabinets made from composites such as acrylic, resin and recycled materials. At Dale's Cafe and Cakery in North Yorkshire, they have solid wood kitchen cabinets. And as you can see here, it can make sense to locate more storage in wall-hung cupboards at a higher level rather than in base units, so that essentially they're really out of harm's way and there's less items exposed to flood risk. Bear in mind though that some of the items will be heavy to lift and move. And what Lisa at the Blue Teapot Cafe found actually was that the large heavy counter was bolted to the floor and made it almost impossible for her to move many of the expensive industrial fridges and freezers out of the property and up to higher ground. So do think through the access routes and dimensions that you have in your building, and what Lisa's now got is actually casters on that countertop so she can roll it out the building and get it up to a safe location when she gets her flood warning. Next, let's look at electrical systems and white goods, as these are obviously going to feature within a catered premises and frequently flood damaged elements. Now again, back to first principles, we want to reduce the exposure of these items to flood risk. And so really the obvious thing to think about is to elevate them, and that can be a really smart move, but it can also get dishwashers that fit within waist-height drawers, and it might be that you raise fridges and freezers up on plinths or even locate them in a low-risk part of the property or off-site entirely. And when it comes to the wiring and systems that power these devices, it makes sense for sockets, utility boxes and power cables for things like laptops and tills to be positioned higher, and wiring fed from the ceiling down. Again, really just so that we're minimising their exposure to that floodwater. It could even be that the wiring's surface mounted in conduits, and it might be that you actually make a feature of that. But be really cautious of where any holes are made in the building's fabric, whether it be for plumbing or wiring, as these can be a potential point and route of floodwater entry. Next, let's look at furniture. As in the event of a flood, you may not have actually much time to move things like tables or chairs, and on many occasions it could prove difficult to get these things through doorways and upstairs. Now it could be that you go for some high-level breakfast bar style seating in areas, perhaps with stainless steel legs. But another approach might actually be to think about specifying or buying chairs and tables that are made of more water-compatible materials and sturdy in terms of their setup. So they could be used to actually place and stack other items on that may need to be raised up and out of harm's way. Or you might actually choose to have tables that can be easily folded and disassembled prior to a flood event. Because obviously fitted seating, as we can see here, can be really difficult to move and could be inundated and require ripping out post-flood. And so I'd say really it comes back to choice and prioritising how you'd want to use the space. And this kind of resilient mindset and thinking needs to run through at all scales and goes right down to the way that you store the items within the business. It can, for example, be that you put tinned foods at lower level in your cupboards and make sure that other items that could be exposed to flood risk are in plastic sealed boxes so they can be really quickly and easily removed. Next, let's look at floors. Now, commercial spaces will, by their very nature, often need hard-wearing floor linings, and so tiled and stone flooring could be well suited and potentially perform better than lino or vinyl in the event of a flood. And it's important to consider the joint between the floors and walls, as this can be a weak point, and so it may be that you use tiled upstands and skirting boards with waterproof grout. And if you have floorboards, they could be specified as hardwood rather than softwood, or even braced so that they don't actually swell and distort when drying. But it might be that you choose to change the floor build up entirely from a suspended timber floor to a solid floor type. So you'd actually take away the underfloor void and remove a potential point and route of floodwater entry into the building. And with something like a solid concrete floor, you do still need to consider how things like the floor screed, its insulation and the floor finishes can be made flood recoverable. You can, for example, specify flood resilient types of screed that dry quicker. And when it comes to insulation, for parts of the building that could come into contact with floodwater, it can make sense to use closed cell insulation types so that they'll be less water absorbed and that they're easier to dry out. Now, floor coverings like carpets can be what we often see filling up skips outside flood damaged homes and businesses. But you could actually design the carpet to be easily rolled up pre-flood and actually have furniture that's easy to lift and move off it. But that can of course take time. So it could instead be that you choose to have something like rugs, and these can be rolled up before a flood event, or specify something like stone, tile or composite flooring with waterproof grout on its joints. And when it comes to walls and wall linings, you can use things like tanking systems and membranes to help limit the actual transference of water through the fabric of a building. And these direct water towards channels around the perimeter of the rooms and can then be moved off and away and out of the building using pump and sump systems. But do bear in mind that these aren't going to be appropriate for every property type or flood risk context. Now, in a space like a kitchen, when it comes to its walls, you might choose to have a tiled surface, but throughout the premises, you could also specify a flood-resilient plasterboard, such as magnesium oxide plasterboard, and this won't necessarily need to be ripped off and removed if flooded. And when it comes to plaster, typically lime cement-based ones perform best and may be able to actually dry out in situ post-flood. But it could be that you actually choose to not have plaster at all and instead expose the structure of the brickwork and the walls, and this can even be treated with sealant. But again, it depends wholly on the flood risk context and the property setup, because what we don't want to be doing is trapping in moisture or unduly infecting the moisture transference through the building's fabric. So again, context is key, and it's important to get professional advice on this. But a larger question that may also be worth reviewing and considering is actually how you lay out the space as a whole. Where you'll store goods and locate your kitchen, as it could make sense to reconfigure this to factor in how frequent and deep floodwater may be in particular parts of the building. Now, we've looked at many of the different approaches that you might consider in stage 3 of the Code of Practice, but stages 4, 5 and 6 are also crucial to be aware of, as these relate to the construction, the commissioning and handover, and operation and maintenance. And these stages are intended to provide clarity and assurance that measures that have been installed have been fitted correctly, that the end users know how to actually operate and maintain them over time. Because it may be that a flood doesn't occur for 15 or 20 years, but you do need to be prepared and actually know which property flood resilience strategies are applicable and relevant and set up for that business. Now, I just want to finish by discussing when you might adapt. And I realise that when the sun's shining and you're focused on the day-to-day running of the business, that flooding might not seem a high priority. But I'd say that really that kind of complacency is potentially the real risk here, as if our businesses are set up and left in a vulnerable state, then if or when that floodwater does arrive, as we can see here, the consequences can be dire. But it might be you're looking to refurbish or improve its layout or energy efficiency, and that can be a great time to make changes, because these measures could really save you and your staff and customers a huge amount of heartache, disruption, waste and expense. So that property flood resilience strategy should be listed out and set out within your business flood plan. And if you haven't got one, then you can use the free flood plan template that we've created. We've made an episode all about this that shows you how to fill it in. And the flood plan crucially bridges a lot of the information that we've covered and actually helps bring together the strategies for resilience on the building with the way in which you need to react to warnings, evacuate, and helps keep a record of key details and the strategies that you've got in place. But really what's important with all of this is to recognise that actually flood resilient design does not have to be a compromise to the style and function of your cafe or restaurant. As we saw in Dale's Cafe and Cakery and the Blue Teapot Cafe, they can still be really beautiful spaces and places. So thanks very much for listening, and if you'd like to keep updated on future episodes, then please subscribe below, hit the bell for notifications, and we look forward to seeing you soon.